We're good? One of the things I emphasize, and it's kind of my main sort of driving interpretive thrust, is that Arkansas is extra rural and wild. Arkansas was the newest part of the Old South, low population, scattered population, and so I really work through slavery in Arkansas and emphasize slaves' place in that, and how space and place is really important. So I'll just get to work here. Although white deed holders, surveyors, speculators, and legislators carved up Arkansas's river valleys, hills, and prairies into plots where corn, cotton, and slavery grew, Arkansas's imprisoned pioneers, African-American slaves, staked their own claims. Particularly, slaves appropriated the uncultivated spaces between farms and fields. And I've kind of stolen this term, uncultivated space, from an environmental historian who originally looked at slavery in rice plantations in coastal Georgia, and he talks about uncultivated space, so I've stolen that. Those spaces between farms and fields, between pastures and fields of cotton and corn, the woods, the canebrake, the river bottoms, all of those good places to hide. They took advantage of the heavily forested terrain, low population, and relative isolation to avoid work, visit family and friends, hold religious meetings, enjoy leisure time, hunt and forage, and escape to freedom. This talk explores slaves' resistance in relation to their environment on the southern periphery, and it also has a bit of an epilogue about what that was like during the Civil War. I just kind of dipped my toe into that. Uncultivated zones blanketed Arkansas. If in Natchez, where less than half the land was under cultivation, as one historian describes it as given over to mostly wild places, then Arkansas's slave neighborhoods lay in a veritable jungle. Territorial law had warned whites that many times slaves run away and lie, hid and lurking in swamps, woods, and other obscure places, killing hogs, committing other injuries to the inhabitants of this district. Arkansas remained covered with obscure places from which slaves could benefit. As lightning fast as bondspeople were made to transform Arkansas's wilderness into seas of staple crops, Arkansas's landscape remained much less developed than her neighbors. So Mississippi, for example, I'm going to throw some numbers at you, so hang in there with me. So for example, Mississippi and Arkansas both had a comparable number of farms in 1860, and I can give you those after if you want to know. Much less of Arkansas's acreage had been improved, and I've grabbed these improved acreage numbers from the census. Arkansas showed fewer than 2 million improved acreage in that year, in contrast to more than 5 million in Mississippi. The region as a whole grew quickly, but the landscape of Arkansas underwent especially dramatic transformation. For example, Mississippians had added 1.5 million improved acres between the census enumerations of 1850 and 1860. While the people of Arkansas cleared fewer in that time, the increase amounted to a doubling of the state's improved farmland in 10 years. Arkansas's ground changed quickly, but remained overrun with uncultivated space. This is where it gets really interesting for me. The difference in development could be stark even directly across state lines. The Mississippi River served as both a political boundary and a natural divider. Farmland in Mississippi and Tennessee counties along the east side of the river boasted almost 5 times more acreage in improved farmland than Arkansas's counties on the West Bank. So what I'm saying here is I took counties on the east side along the Mississippi River that were directly across from Arkansas, grabbed all of those counties, added it up, compared it to Arkansas's counties on the other side, and that's where I'm getting that difference. It's not, I'm not looking at the state as a whole on one side and the other. So what I'm saying is just across the river, it could be that different. Slave communities were also much smaller. The slave population was 78% lower in Arkansas counties along the Mississippi as compared to those on the east side in 1850, and at least 63% lower in 1860. And the reason I've got that weasel word at least is because there are a couple of counties in Mississippi that there's no data for the 1860s. So for the numbers I have, it's a 63% difference. It's probably more. It's actually probably more than 80. So Arkansas's total slave population amounted to about a sixth of Mississippi's in 1850 and a quarter in 1860, if that helps. So the slave population in Arkansas's riverside counties grew faster than their counterparts along the eastern bank. While riverside slave populations grew by 150% in Arkansas between 1850 and 1860, those in Mississippi experienced only a 34% increase in those years, which is also skewed by a couple of those counties. Thus, while the convergence of political and natural boundaries in the Mississippi River seems to have created a lag in the development of Arkansas's side, Arkansas's transformation is more dramatic. I have more here, and I've kept this page of notes in case anybody really wanted to dig in, kind of geek out with me with this after the session is over, if you want to look more about those. There is also a pretty dramatic difference, although not quite so, between southern Arkansas counties and northern Louisiana counties. It's not as drastic as on the other sides of the river, but there's still something about Arkansas's development. And I say all that to say that that's the landscape on which slaves lived. It's rugged. It's a low population. It's a scattered population. And that really matters. I like to say, when you're looking at Arkansas right before the Civil War, it's an 1860 slave regime on an 1830s landscape, when you think of it in terms of other slave states. So place and space were central to slave struggle in Arkansas. While whites mounted the comprehensive campaign of establishing a strong regime there, slaves engaged in the politics of space. Although their voices were not heard in Arkansas State House or courtrooms, slaves' terrain of struggle, to steal another word from another historian, lay in their neighborhoods. Neighborhoods were made up of fields and homes as well as the forests and brush between, tied together by slaves' social networks. Slaves assigned meaning to and extracted the best uses out of their surroundings. Their constructions of neighborhood and habits of resistance overlay the natural topography, putting particular meaning on those places in between fields and pastures. Anthony Taylor described the patchwork of cultivated and wild space owned by the Bullocks in Clark County. He said most of the farm was fir pine country land. There would be 30 or 40 acres here of cultivation, and then 30 or 40 acres over there of woods and so on. Spaces in the wilderness, like the Clark County swathes of pine forest described by Taylor, served as the sites of slave resistance and autonomy, while the fields represented zones inhibited by whites' regulation and desire for profit. The forests, brush, and river bottoms, meanwhile, represented opportunity. Slaves on the southern periphery used the abundant, uncultivated wilderness to resist dehumanization. So, like farmers all over the South, slaves understood the world around them through its natural cycles. This is evident in interviews of former slaves, in which they might measure their ages and stages of life through references to natural events or seasons. For example, Peter Brown's father remembered and expressed his age based on the fact that he was a small boy before the stars fell, and we think he's possibly referring to a meteor shower of the 1850s. Charlie Hinton of Jefferson County referred to himself and other children as undergrowth when recounting stories of his childhood. As children, slaves played in streams and woods surrounding the farms and fields, learning about the workings of nature in the landscape while they acquired a worldview informed by their surroundings. Children were taught stories of morals and understandings of nature by older people who related with youngsters and got them to sit still via tales of animals. Aunt Patsy at the Bullock plantation wove Christian scripture with tales of nature when she explained to children how God had slipped a tight skin over the serpent's legs to cause him and his progeny to crawl on their stomachs. Bond's people knew their environment in Arkansas well because they lived closer to the ground. They learned about the landscape when they hauled cotton to the river, accompanied masters to town, walked to visit loved ones, washed clothes in springs, searched for livestock, hunted, and hid. Mart, a slave of the Bozeman family in South Arkansas, gained knowledge of the woods, streams, and blackland prairie south of Arkadelphia when he moved about in his work, but also picked up such intelligence when he covered ground with whites. Mart sometimes accompanied white men of his neighborhood when they took long hikes for pleasure or to scope out potential real estate purchases. For example, one spring he joined the plantation's overseer, Henry Bozeman, a cousin, and a neighbor, D.F. Ross, surveying down the Terre Noire Creek. Mart may even have served as a guide. Nearby, the Bullock slaves periodically made the 5-mile trip for the mail, giving them time out and about in the countryside. The knowledge gained from these excursions armed bondspeople with the valuable intelligence they could use for themselves and pass on to others. One opportunity in particular for bondspeople to learn the terrain presented itself in animal husbandry. Slaves might care for hundreds of head of stock on one plantation, while animals that were used for riding, plowing, or hauling were generally kept in stables and pastures. Stock raising in the antebellum South often amounted to turning hoofed animals loose to forage in the cane brakes to be rounded up later. Hogs particularly roamed the brush and bottoms to be gathered up from time to time, most notably in the yearly autumn slaughter. Nelson Denson explained of Arkansas's landscape. The timber made it a good place for cattle and hogs, for at that time they ran out in the woods free. Thus, slaves caring for stock worked a great deal of time away from cultivated and cleared spaces. They herded cattle and rustled up hogs from the woods, cane, prairies, and swamps, all the while gaining useful knowledge of the terrain. On the Bozeman plantation, slaves Mart and Anthony cared for sheep and followed strays when they went up into the mountains, the Washtas, when they wandered away from the flock. The miles that slaves like Mart and Anthony trekked through the forested areas, away from the fields, added to their knowledge of the landscape. Now, I do have a couple of drownings here connected with slave stock driving that we can talk about if we have time, at the end. So ask me about that if you want to know about those. While enslaved people on the margins gathered and shared what they knew about the dangers and opportunities of the landscape, they also shared methods for applying that knowledge for their own good. For example, places on the edge of fields and pastures supplied the herbs and roots that slaves used to care for each other's ailing bodies. They passed the knowledge of harvesting those leaves, berries, and roots down generations and carried on traditions of applying them as medical remedies or even in the practice of conjuring. Slaves used their knowledge of the terrain to spread news, too. The power of news, gossip, and warnings worked against the framework of mastery that whites created to rule slavery's frontier. Slaves swept the countryside for information through subtle listening and discreet sharing, much to the exasperation of whites who well knew the power of that network. John Bates described the spread of news in Pulaski County, and I'm going to paraphrase a quote by him. Well, during those times, just like today, nearly everybody knew what was going on. News traveled pretty fast. If the slaves couldn't get it to each other by getting a pass, they would slip out after dark and go to another plantation the back way to get it scattered. For slaves, the back way, through the trees and brush and away from roads and open spaces, served as the most efficient way to scatter that intelligence. The back ways, brush, and bottom served several uses. In addition to extracting health remedies from the forest and crafting news networks through them, slaves used uncultivated space as cover in the fight to exert power over their spiritual lives. Slaves who were forbidden from possessing Bibles, praying, or gathering for religious services might covertly continue their practice in the woods and brush. O.W. Green's family secretly met to hear preaching and to shout, which is to participate in charismatic worship, in the woods with other slaves, even though they risked severe punishment if discovered. The old master of that place in Bradley County was good, insisted Green, but when he found you shouting, he burnt your hand. My grandmother said he burnt her hand several times. Far from wilderness to slaves who made use of them, the woods became sanctified sites where slaves could worship freely out of the sight and earshot of whites. Uncultivated space also provided refuge from work and punishment. Slaves ran away to these wild spaces often, if only for a while. Indeed, for slaveholders and slaves alike, the phrase "in the woods" was synonymous with runaways. On the Chico County Hilliard plantation, Franklin exasperated the mistress, who noted that he was in the woods one summer. Charlie McClendon's father laid out in the woods of Jefferson County for at least a month on one occasion. Another man on the same place, Miles Johnson, just stayed in the woods, stealing away so often that the master eventually decided to sell him off. The forest, brush, and cane aided truant slaves in avoiding punishment and work. That very strategy was evident in Peter Brown's story of his parents' lives under slavery in Phillips County. When the Hunts forced his mother to work too hard while pregnant, his father stole her out to the canebrake. According to Brown's account, his parents were approached by a panther in the night, which his father killed with a bowie knife. Then his mother gave birth out in the canebrake. Thenceforward, as long as Brown's father promised to stay out of the woods, then his mother, who was now recognized by the profit-minded master as a good breeder, would no longer have to work in the fields. Whether the details of the remarkable story are true or exaggerated by a proud son, Brown's story suggests the power of the bargaining chip that bondspeople wielded when they fled into surrounding forests. Slaves often brought food and provisions to their friends who were in the woods. In Dallas County, June and Damon ran away together into the canebrake across the Washita River from the Bullock plantation and hid in a small cave they had dug. They foraged for food, but also relied on what other slaves brought out to them. In fact, to catch the two men, whites followed the trail left in the cane by slaves who had been provisioning them. And then there's I've got a little note here about Herrick Bailey Bullock Daniels' memoir. And so ask me about that if you want to know about her. She wrote a creepy poem about the slaves, and she mentions this guy. Escape into the forests of Arkansas was a popular strategy for slaves in more populated zones as well. And this is where I differ from Paul Lack's article on slavery in Little Rock, where he suggests that, if you're a runaway slave, the city is where you want to go. As much of a city as Little Rock, was at that time. I totally disagree. I think that you might run to the city if somebody you knew was there that you wanted to be with, but otherwise it was too easy to get noticed. But as much as town life might offer slaves in other ways, the woods provided them a place for recreation or simply for time away from whites' demands. Frank, owned by David Fulton, who lived just outside Little Rock, was sent into the woods one day to gather firewood for the night, but instead stayed out all day. Frank, and I'm going to quote from the source here, sank into the arms of Morpheus, where he remained until 4 o'clock, leaving the house freezing and without firewood. In later years, Frank, like so many others, finally ran away for good and was sold while in the woods. The uncultivated space enclosing Little Rock during the territorial period hosted a base camp for runaway slaves who snuck into town at night to steal provisions and may have supported marooned slaves up into the late 1850s. Slaves used wild spaces as a refuge in another way as well when they hunted and fished the woods and waters of Arkansas. Game was plentiful, though probably not quite as abundant as the Kentucky friends of the Hilliards believed after having heard, quote, such accounts of the game of our country, they imagine a fire at the gatepost or in any direction will bring down the buck. Animals valuable for their flesh or skins, such as wolves, bears, deer, and turkey, were so abundant in the Washita Valley that Mariah, the cook at the Bullock Frontier Plantation, stepped out the door and killed a wild turkey with a stick. And where I'm from, it's very unnatural to pronounce the G on the end of huntin', but I'm just going to do it for the sake of a formal presentation. Slave hunting and fishing provided relief from the crop routine, held cultural and community value, and offered slaves an avenue to push back against their bondage by claiming time and resources for their own. As historian Walter Johnson explains, the landscape of forage and that of resistance overlapped in the woods and swamps of Cotton Kingdom. Family members who hunted or fished together strengthened bonds. For example, in her golden years, Mittie Freeman cherished memories of fishing with her father in Washita County. For slave families, game and forage supplemented their food sources, and the sharing of nature's bounty could forge ties in the quarters. When Betty Brown's mother hunted and trapped in Greene County, she fulfilled part of what whites expected as masters, but she also provided for her family's material needs. Friendships and social ties were forged and strengthened on these hunts, like those between Scott Bond and other young men and boys during frequent nighttime expeditions for possum, I'm never going to say the O in that one, and raccoons in the woods of Cross County. Slaves went hunting with masters too, which might have felt less like recreation and more like work, and we don't want to make too much of that, because we don't really know. In doing so, though, they learned the terrain, they forged whites' trust, and may have valued some time away from the drudgery of their usual work. Joe Bean squirrel hunted on horseback with his master in the woods of Washington County. Little Bill, trusted with more autonomy than other slaves owned by Henry Shugart in southern Arkansas, accompanied the master to the swamps on duck hunting excursions. It's not clear, however, if Bill simply carried supplies or shot birds himself. The Bullock slaves hunted with whites for possum and other small game. When Master Bullock and his sons or guests hunted deer, slaves might have to run through the woods to drive them by the stands for whites to shoot. Does that make sense? They might have the slaves run through the woods to sort of herd the deer towards the deer stand. Full-blown hunting expeditions could be dangerous. In 1823, Ben, owned by Frenchman and founder of New Gascony, Antoine Barak, lost his life during the height of Osage rage against whites and other native groups in Arkansas. He was one of several men killed when a hunting party made up of whites and Quapaw was ambushed by Osages in western Arkansas Territory. Bringing in meat, fish, and skins could endear slaves to whites who benefited from their success in Arkansas's woods and streams. When the mistress fretted over how best to impress out-of-town and seemingly more well-to-do guests at the Hilliard Plantation in Chico County, slave Rob saved the day by bringing in a tremendous turtle and half a dozen magnificent trout. The guests were treated with turtle soup and a dinner that went off admirably in the eyes of the mistress, thanks to Rob's provision. Slaves could bring in cash, too. When Arkansas law allowed county courts to set bounties for wolf scalps, it specified that masters could collect for wolves hunted or trapped by slaves. Although I can't tell you how many wolves might have been killed by slaves in that effort. Autonomy in other regards and privileges to hunt or fish might have been mutually reinforcing. For example, Tom, who performed a lot of the important business for the Browns, and that's the Browns, the Camden Browns, such as errands to town, would fish for the family at times, too. He might have initially received chances to go out fishing because he had been trustworthy in the first place, or he might have been able to secure those other chances by bringing in fish for the white family. The ability to go out into the woods alone could be a perk of privileged status, and the demonstration of profitable hunting or fishing could create its own rewards. Slaves' appropriation of uncultivated space, whether for spreading news, for religious meetings, parties, or hunting, did not mean that danger and oppression disappeared. In fact, hazard was inherent in their pursuit to claim those zones. There are a couple of drownings that we can talk about if you guys want to, but there's also dangers. Animals like snakes, bears, mountain lions lurked in Arkansas's thick woods. The following description by John Wesley reflected the restrictions imposed on a child by a mother worried about those very dangers. He said, "Wild animals and snakes was one thing we had to look out for. Grown folks and children all kept around home unless you had business and went on a trip." In Wesley's characterization, the plantation and farm grounds represented relatively safe and regimented space, while going out from that perimeter was only for those who had business. Plenty of slaves took up the business of subversion in the forests and cane, but the woods might also be sites of white violence against slaves. When Woodruff Northworthy took a slave off into the woods of Jefferson County to punish him for stealing a visitor's shirt, young Horatio Williams followed. He told an interviewer that the master took the man down into the bottom. "I crawled through the brush and watched. They tied his feet together over a limb and let his head hang down and beat him till the blood ran down on the roots of that tree." It may have been that Northworthy felt added anger fueled by the embarrassment of having his house guests' things tampered with. The master's removal of the man into the woods may have been designed to prevent the guests from witnessing the brutal punishment, but it represents whites' willingness to use the cover of uncultivated space to exact violence upon slaves. It's also significant, however, that Northworthy only thought that his actions had gone unobserved. His hidden witness serves as an example of slaves' readiness to contravene whites' regime in the woods. The dangers of wild spaces are part of what makes slaves' appropriation of them that much more meaningful. So all this is not to say that slaves in Arkansas failed to achieve gains in cultivated space, right, in populated space, on the farm, in the towns. Like bondspeople all over the South, slaves in Arkansas negotiated their circumstances to their advantage the best they could. And often the background to their success included roads, public spaces, whites' homes. I've got one example. In 1854, when 2 slaves were hired out by a man named Diamond in Phillips County to a small slaveholder, J.C. Berry, these 2 men ran away, declaring that they had been mistreated by their temporary master. Diamond returned them with instructions to come home again if they were hit a lick. In this way, the Diamond slaves got around the demands in the contract of their hired master by pleading to their owner. Knowing that the master was sympathetic, these slaves reckoned that knocking on his front door could achieve their goals with less risk than hiding in the woods. So this is just a choice that slaves are making all the time. So slaveholders and slaves contested Arkansas's ground in the antebellum period. Arkansas remained rugged, thick with uncultivated space. The low and scattered population of land with slow access to goods and information was dominated by forests. Some level of slave autonomy was beneficial, even necessary, in places where slaves needed to hunt, run errands, catch hogs, etc. While slaves were forced to work at transforming uncultivated canebrakes and woods into cash crops, they made their own meanings of the seams between white domains. Bondspeople socialized, worshipped, traded, ate, and hid under the canopy of Arkansas's woods. Arkansas was covered with forests and canebrake in which slaves could resist work, socialize, spread news, have fun, gather food. You get it? All that stuff. The swamps, forests, and canebrakes, they offered that cover for leisure, and they also offered sustenance. Uncleared land paved the highway of runaways crisscrossing Arkansas and provided cover for prayer meetings and social gatherings. Brush and forest became prayer chapels and gambling rings. Forests and streams provided food and recreation. So then the question is, what happens when the war begins? So I have a bit of an epilogue here for you, and I've just kind of scratched the surface of this in my work so far, and I'm very interested in finding out more. I do have a quotation for you from Governor Rector when he's trying to convince Arkansas's leadership to secede from the Union, to get us thinking about this. An irrepressible conflict, says he, Lincoln, is going on between freedom and slavery. That institution is now upon its trial before you. And if we mean to defend and transmit it to our children, let us terminate this Northern crusade by forming a separate government in which no conflict can ensue. Does there exist inside the borders of Arkansas any diversity of sentiment as to the religious or moral right of holding Negro slaves? God, in his omnipotent wisdom, I believe, created the cotton plant, the African slave, and the lower Mississippi Valley to clothe and feed the world, and a gallant race of men and women produced upon its soil to defend it and execute that decree. This is the governor of Arkansas. So you get this kind of a sense for whites what the natural landscape is about. This is part of God's creation as much as slavery is part of God's creation in their minds. So when the war begins, everybody knows what it's about. And slaves then, though, find themselves negotiating this space in a different way. They end up hiding with whites at the demand of whites rather than to frustrate whites. So I have some different examples here for you. Let me skip to... While newcomers, this is people being taken to Arkansas with planters fleeing other parts of the South. So while those people are being forced into the wilds of Arkansas, bondspeople who were already there, they could be moved or hidden even within their own neighborhoods as whites tried to keep them out of freedom's reach. Upon the approach of Federals, many slaveholders would take their slaves into the very places that they were normally exasperated to find them, and that's in the woods. When Union soldiers got too close, Solomon Lambert recalled, "Master Lambert then hid the slaves in the bottoms. We carried provisions and they sent more along. We stayed 2 or 3 days or a week when they heard a regiment coming through. We didn't care if they hit us. We heard the guns. We didn't want to go down there." The same cane, woods, and brush where truant slaves sought cover from masters and overseers became targets for whites looking to hide their own slaves. Whites who used to follow trails into the cane to catch slave hideouts now created such paths themselves as they provisioned slaves that they hid in those spaces. As Lambert explained, slaves who complied with their concealment did so out of fear. Other African Americans spoiled some of those plans, though, when they told of the hidden whereabouts. Johnson Chapman of Columbia explained to William Woodruff that hidden slaves who were found it was due invariably through bad faith of some of the Negroes. So some slaves are telling about these hiding places so that the Federals could find them in the woods. Knowing the danger of keeping slaves so near the tempting highway of the Mississippi River within easy access of Union soldiers, planters along the river often moved slaves to the interior of the state. Chico planter Charles C. Stewart explained, "We have all moved our hands some distance from the river, but have no work of value to do." One officer recorded, "The plantation seemed to be almost a waste. The slaves have nearly all been moved back further in the country and elsewhere." And so, of course, a great many slaves took charge of their own movement to seek freedom with the Federal Army. Boston Blackwell described that journey, fleeing from the Blackwell plantation to Pine Bluff in October 1863. He said, "We made the stream for a long piece, heard the hounds a-howling, getting ready for to chase after us. Then we hid in dark woods. It was cold, frosty weather, 2 days and two nights we traveled. The boy got hungry. He wanted to fall by the way, but I drug him on. When we got to the Yankee camp, all of our troubles were over." Some people might disagree with that statement. I got one more for you. One commander on the USS Carondelet reported in July 62 that slaves were very numerous, standing under the banks of the river and making signals to us at night asking to be taken away. So you can kind of visualize the use of that area. So another thing that pushed slaves into the woods during the war was the fact that the Confederate leadership in Arkansas is, of course, wanting to use slave labor in the war effort, and planters didn't always agree with that demand. Slaveholders and slaves alike balked at the orders of conscription of slave labor for the Confederate war effort. Slaves did not care to get injured or separated from family, while masters worried about their property loss in a war that was already proving economically devastating. Slaves and masters then often worked together to avoid the impressment of slave labor. In response to a call for slaves to work on breastworks, slaveholders in eastern Arkansas sent as few as they could get away with. A.M. Boyd's father-in-law sent only one man and then went to Lake Village to make a speech against the conscription of slave labor, declaring it was too deadly to put slaves to work in the unhealthy swamps. When the requisition for slave manpower was repeated, Boyd's overseer, Mr. Headsmith, instructed the Boyd slaves to, quote, "put out to the woods, and he would send us provisions till we could get to the Yankees. And he had to leave the country. We stayed in the woods about 3 weeks." The group then made their way to the Mississippi River. Similarly, James Pine, slave driver of the Joseph Deputy place, remembered, "The rebels tried to press some hands from Deputy to work on Fort Pillow up the river, but Deputy had us colored men posted to give notice when the pressers were coming, so we could get back in the woods and run the horses and mules in the cane." In these evasions, the spaces at the seams of fields of corn and cotton were redefined. Instead of truant and runaway slaves hiding in the forests and brush awaiting provision from sympathetic fellow slaves, hidden bondspeople did so at the urging of whites and waited for their masters and overseers to provision them, as I discussed earlier. Masters hated to see their investment working in the malarial swamps out of their sight, and slaves looked out for their own safety and security. Thus, the goals of bondspeople and those who claimed mastery over them momentarily aligned in the brush and cane. And here's where it looks like I have a couple of minutes to mention the Mecklin farm up in Washington County. And this is something that Rebecca Howard at the University of Arkansas has presented on, maybe a little bit here, definitely at one of the Arkansas Historical Association meetings. And that is that during the war, old man Mecklin is having to kind of hide, at home, or like maybe hide in the bushes in fear, while his slave is able to take more of a public role. So Wesley is hunting, bringing game into Fayetteville to sell. He's moving about in town, up and down all these public spaces freely, without technically being free just yet, while his master is sort of like cowering at the sound of hoofs, right? So there is kind of a flip there that's pretty interesting. The seams between farms and plantations, formerly the domains of runaways, truants, and their pursuers, or of slaves' covert religious meetings or parties, became flooded with whites who now found reason to hide. Federals, rebels, guerrillas, and opportunists took to the cane and brush. But bondspeople did not give up those spaces. Fugitives from slavery traversed Arkansas's forests and river bottoms in their treks for freedom and security behind Union lines. Men and women still held by the chains of slavery were hastened into the uncultivated zones of cotton country by whites looking to keep them out of reach of Union soldiers who wanted to free and arm them, and of Confederates who wanted them to dig trenches and build breastworks. While the roads were marched and towns occupied by soldiers, Arkansas's forests and canebrakes became populated with a spectrum of motivations. This shifting landscape required slaves to make hard choices. Some were able to increase their autonomy and occupy public spaces, represented by Wesley Mecklin and some others, like never before, while others had to lay in wait until the time was right. So I do have a couple of things that I want to mention here. One is that poor whites are in the woods too, like this whole time, okay? My job in my work is to place what slaves do against what masters want them to do, right? So I'm really kind of focused on that resistance. But there's poor whites all over the place in the woods. And in fact, there is evidence suggesting that that's sometimes who slaves are meeting to gamble and drink and all those things that people like to do in the 19th century, right? And so that should be mentioned for sure. And the other thing I want to mention is that I'm really interested in what the relationship might be in the process of achieving freedom and in the years after the war, that relationship between freedom, ideas of freedom, and this space. Does the hope for African American autonomy then shift to more urban places, and the woods become less important when you have emancipation in the years after the war, or does it stay just as important? That's a question I have that I'd like to dig into a little more. So